So we've entered a new section of the Gospel of John. You may not feel like it when you turn the page from chapter 5 to chapter 6, but we really do. Up to this point, in the first 5 chapters of the book, John has been giving us new information about Jesus. It almost seemed like he was deliberately avoiding the other Gospels in the material. They would talk about Jesus actually coming into the water and then coming out. Well, John didn't really talk about that. He talked about the other Gospels talk about the calling of the disciples, and they focus on Peter and on James and John. And, well, John focuses on people named Philip and Nathaniel. Nathaniel isn't even one of the 12. It's like there's a different approach. The other Gospels don't mention turning water into wine. They don't mention a man named Nicodemus coming by night. They don't talk about a Samaritan woman meeting Jesus at a well. And they certainly didn't talk about this lame man over at Bethesda and that whole ruckus that was created because of it. But then all of a sudden, John brings us right back in focus and gives us a context for everything that Jesus is doing. And he brings us back to the Sea of Galilee, to a very familiar place, on a mountainside, by the lake, with a multitude of people who have been following him all day long, and the sun's going down, and they're hungry. This is probably one of the most famous stories in the Bible about Jesus and how he meets people's needs. And so, I think John did this to give us a context, to letting us know that he's not going completely off the wall, but all of these things that he's filling in, they're fill-ins, and they're giving us a new perspective on Jesus that the other Gospels were not providing. Another thing that he did was give us a time slot in here. He tells us that this happened near a Passover. So now a whole year has passed from when Jesus began his ministry. And remember, Jesus began his ministry the way the other Gospels have him ended, with a bullwhip. And so John does this, and a year has passed, and now we are at Passover again. But instead of Jesus going to Jerusalem, he kind of brings the Passover to Galilee. And it's not an official one, but it's interesting that the Passover is considered the feast of unleavened bread. And it is during this time that Jesus is showing himself as the bread of life, as we'll find out in a couple of weeks. But he's presenting bread to the people. Now remember last week we talked about how Jesus saw himself as the prophet that was going to come, that was like Moses. And you'll remember, Moses did some things that reflect on Jesus. One of the things is the manna. Moses was around and he was leading the people when manna, bread, came from heaven and fed the people and sustained them in the wilderness. And now here comes Jesus, and he's doing very much the same thing. So that's the story that we are experiencing here. Jesus presenting himself, healing people, teaching people. People are now following him, and there's a pretty good-sized crowd. And what we hear and what we read is that the Passover was there, and Jesus lifted up his eyes, and he saw this multitude. One of my heroes in Christendom, or Christianity, would be Hudson Taylor. And I like Hudson Taylor because he was an adventurer. He was the kind of guy that would just pack up everything and go across the world and blaze a trail where there was no trail. I kind of did that as well in my younger days. Not as dramatic as him, of course, but I wanted to go to seminary and I wanted to go to Germany at the same time. And so I found a seminary that had a relationship with a school in Germany, and nobody had ever gone there before. And to my knowledge, nobody's gone there since. But I blazed a trail and I did something new and unique. I like to do that. I guess that's why I'm here in Waupaca County. I didn't come from here, but that's where I am. Hudson Taylor did the same thing. He was burdened for the people in China, and he went there, and he started doing things no one else did. Instead of just staying in Hong Kong and in the safe seaports, he started to go into inland. And he began to show himself to be one of the people. He grew his hair in the way that the Chinese did in those days, with a long ponytail and braided. He kept his face shaved, and he wore the clothes that they wore, trying to fit in so that they would trust him. And to a degree it worked. The amazing thing is that he began to call other people to come with him. And God raised up hundreds of missionaries over time, and he started a mission society called the China Inland Mission. One of his famous sayings is, "God's will done in God's way will never lack God's supply." And I think about that when I think of our church, the Royalton Christian Church. God's will done in God's way will never lack God's supply. And this story tells us how God does this. First of all, we need to understand what God's will is. In this particular case, God's will was to feed the people. Verse 5, "And Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." So sometimes God will put a difficult task in front of us, and we wonder what's going to happen next. Now, the first thing we need to do when we see that difficult task in front of us is to ascertain, yes, this really is God's will. This is a test of our faith. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes God is really shutting a door and He's moving us in a different direction. And we need to be sensitive to that as well. The only way we can really become clear in our own hearts is through prayer, through reading of Scripture, and through counsel from other godly people. That's how we find out what God's will is for us as individuals, for us as families, and for us as a Christian community. So, that's one of the reasons why we are inviting people to come to our home for prayer and worship tonight, so that we can pray for the church and for the people that are in it. There was a case when the China Inland Mission had some difficult times, and a revolution was occurring throughout the country, or throughout the world, I should say, where communism was beginning to take over. It was in the midst of that my grandparents answered the call of Hudson Taylor, and they moved to China. In the actually it was right after World War I that they did that. So they moved out there, and they stayed there for about 20 years. Actually, it might have been longer than that. My mother was born in Shanghai, and she lived there right up until she was about 15 years old. At that point, a revolution occurred within China, and all of the Americans and any Europeans, anybody that wasn't Chinese, was kicked out of the country, except for those people that they thought were being insurrectionists. My grandfather was held as a prisoner of war for just under a year in a concentration camp, while the rest of his family was sent back to the United States. He did eventually get released, and he came back. But you know what? There hasn't been a missionary to China from the China Inland Mission since. And they needed to evaluate what it was that they wanted to do. Are they going to try to sneak into China and maybe get themselves killed? They prayed about it, and they read Scripture, and they talked to one another, and they decided they needed to change their focus. And so they changed their name too. They're no longer the China Inland Mission, they are now the Overseas Missionary Fellowship. And so my uncle, who was also raised in China, he signed up with the OMF, and he ended up being a missionary to the Philippines. So these things happen, and our plans change. So Jesus tests us. He wants us to know how we are going to respond with the difficulties that are in front of us. Are we just going to lay over and die? Are we going to push through even though it's insanity? Or are we going to sit back and evaluate and pray? I hope that we evaluate and pray and then move on what God is calling us to do. When we look at our resources, it's tempting to look at the money. We look at our bank account and we determine, well, we need to raise some money, or people need to start giving more, or maybe we need to have a raffle or a chicken sale or something, because that's a good way of earning money, right? And that's not a bad thing to do. We just need to understand that the money in itself may not be adequate for what God is really calling us to do. And the reason I say it's not a bad thing is, well, the disciples themselves, who were being led by Jesus, had a bank account. And their bank account had 200 days' wages in it, 200 denarii. So Philip answered him and says, if we wipe out our bank account, that's still not enough to feed everybody, even a bite. So he evaluated and he realized, we're not up to this task. This is not an easy problem. We're not going to be able to solve it on our own. And sometimes it's like that for us, isn't it? We might even feel like we're there right now. Although, the reality is, the Royalton Christian Church has been around for 150 years, and the solution may be in people giving more, but the solution may be in people giving their all. What I'm talking about is not just our resources, but everything that we are. Our gifts, our wisdom, our creativity. So Philip's answer was, sorry, we can't do it. Maybe they need to go to the stores and buy it themselves. I have a hunch that if 5,000 people descended on the little towns that were nearby, there wouldn't have been enough food even then. So it wasn't just a matter of not enough money. They were really in a pickle. They were in a spot where they had to trust God.